The Bob Murphy Show, episode 361.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Bob Murphy Show. Today I'm going to be speaking with Steve Patterson, who's been a guest here several times on The Bob Murphy Show. We've talked about all kinds of things, including, most controversially, Steve does not like the way infinity has been handled in modern mathematics. And I think that really was the episode with him that I got the most pushback on. But in any event, he is here today to kick another hornet's nest, this time talking about the book that he co-wrote with Roger Ver. And the book is entitled Hijacking Bitcoin. And I think some of you are going to be seriously triggered by this. So let me just say at the outset, number one, I'm going to have Stefan Livera come on and give the other side to this narrative that you're going to hear presented. And I am not taking sides on this. But I read Roger's, it's the author's list is Roger Ver with Steve Patterson. So I read Roger's book, or I haven't read every single page of it, but I read enough to realize what he was doing in it. And I realized, this is interesting stuff, because I had sort of had a narrative in my head about what happened with Bitcoin. And then in reading the book, and then you'll see in the discussion I have with Steve here, it reminded me that, the way Bitcoin was explained and what it was going to be when it first came out in excited libertarian circles is not what it is right now, and is not how its biggest defenders right now are describing what it will be and what role it serves. Okay, that doesn't mean there was skullduggery afoot, and that's what I'm going to have Stefan on to talk about, and to give his perspective as to why that narrative may have evolved over time. But my point is just I did realize and it raised certain things. So anyway, I think it's important, if you're a Bitcoin fan, to at least hear both sides, which we'll give you here at the Bob Murphy Show, and you can decide. Okay, so without further ado, here is my discussion with Steve Patterson on the book Hijacking Bitcoin. Steve, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun to speak with you.
Well, we are here to primarily discuss the book Hijacking Bitcoin, but before we get, do you want to hold it up?
Yeah, no, I got it.
Okay.
There
it is.
Plugging it.
Before we get into that, though, and folks, in case you are concerned, I did check, and Roger says it helps him if we talk about his case. And in some situations, no, don't say anything, because we're fighting it legal with the lawyers and whatnot. But he said yes, go ahead and talk about it. Can you just speak to the situation of Roger Ver, who is the primary author of this book? Just what his current situation is, to the best of your knowledge?
Yes. So in late April, less than a month after we released Hijacking Bitcoin, Roger was arrested in Spain and is currently being detained and held there and facing extradition from Spain on alleged tax evasion, and also another charge of mail fraud, which we have to talk about, which is comical and absurd. But the IRS is claiming that he didn't pay enough taxes when he renounced his citizenship back in 2014. So for people who don't know, there's this thing called an exit tax, which is when you renounce citizenship, if you have a sufficient amount of assets, they essentially say you have to estimate what your assets would be worth if you were to sell them all in a day, and then give us a cut of that, and then we'll maybe allow you to renounce citizenship. And so because he was an early Bitcoin investor, he hired the top law firm to try to make sure his taxes were immaculate for the exit tax, because he thought they're probably going to come after me because I'm already in their crosshairs. He's already upset them anyway. So he tried to do his taxes, to the letter. And 10 years after this exit tax was paid, they're now coming after him and saying, no, you didn't pay up enough. You owe us, you owe us more money. And just to say, to try to threaten him and to try to make an example of him, they're trying to add on charges of mail fraud, which come with like 20 years.
And I'm assuming
prison.
that's because they have video of him like breaking open blue boxes and taking other people's credit card payments and crossing their names out and putting his name in. That's surely what that means, right?
Yeah, close. It turns out he's something even more egregious, Bob, which is that he filed his taxes through the mail.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, can you believe it? And I talked to him about this, and he said at the time there wasn't even an option for him to file these complex taxes digitally. So because he filed the aforementioned taxes through the physical mail, they're saying, you sent false returns through the mail. That's another 20 years. So they're trying to make an example out of him. And there's quite a large movement of people now that are trying to call for Roger to get him preemptively pardoned from the president to try to avoid jail time. He's facing, I think the maximum sentence is like 109 years or something, utterly absurd. They're trying to throw him away for the rest of his life. So if anybody wants to learn more details on it, there's a website. It's called freerogernow.org. And you can sign a petition there, and you can also learn more about his case.
And partly, so one thing is just when you told me that just in personal conversation, Steve, about the mail fraud, I think my reaction was like, that's what they did. Was the movie The Firm with Tom Cruise when he's working for you haven't? Okay, well,
haven't seen it.
Folks may get the reference that I won't spoil it, but anyway, that's part of the plot that he's going up against some mafia guys. And anyway, I won't say more, but that's what I thought of there. And also on this, I think they're different cases, obviously, but just like with the Ross Ulbricht case, where I would always stress to people, this, to like libertarians especially, so look at this isn't merely, oh yeah, in a free society, having a website where drugs are sold would be legal, and so he should. No, even given what the law is, what happened to Ross was just insane. And so the same thing here, that yeah, there's a sense in which every tax is theft and blah blah blah. But the point, like you're saying, is Roger, according to my understanding, I wasn't there looking over his shoulder, he did try to, quote, comply with the law and he didn't want them chasing him the rest of his life. That would be silly.
Yes, actively. And from my understanding, he's also he's asking them right now to tell me exactly what you think I owe. And please explain it to me so that I can, we'll have a discussion and then I can write you a check if you think there has been malfeasance that's taken place. So they're not willing to negotiate with him at all. They want to throw him in jail for criminal prosecution rather than, I don't know what they are going to try to get from him, $50 million, $100 million. They're not even interested in that because it's about the principle. And I should mention, like Ross's case, which was egregious, they sentenced him, for example, for crimes, accusations that the government withdrew. So they tried to sentence Ross for part of the sentencing was like for murder for hire charges, which the government dropped because they were fraudulent. They couldn't prove them. But the judge said, well, that doesn't matter. We're gonna make an example out of you. And in fact, if I recall correctly, the judge even increased Ross's sentence because she wasn't convinced that he had given up his libertarian beliefs.
Yeah, it was something insane.
Totally insane. Yeah, totally insane. Well, in Roger's case, they violated attorney-client privilege. So it appears to be this was a legal fight stretching back many years with Roger. The law firm that he went with, they had a junior attorney and a higher attorney, and they essentially, I don't know if they raided the offices or they bullied one of the attorneys to giving up attorney privileged communication, privileged information that the attorney had with Roger, and when the attorney didn't know any better. And then the senior attorney said, what are you doing? You can't do this. We got to put a stop to this. But it looks like they also violated another legal principle here, which is that, your communications between attorney and client are supposed to be sacred. You're not supposed to have access to those. The government's not supposed to have access to those.
Yep. So, and this underscores, I've seen sentiment from various libertarians in social media about Roger's case saying, I'm paraphrasing, but yeah, I often, in terms of the Bitcoin battles, have not been on Roger's side necessarily, but I think we can all agree that what the government's trying to do to him right
Yeah.
now is insane, things along those lines. So I think, by the same token, we could express that here. So now moving on to the more controversial stuff among libertarian circles, Steve, you are here. So first of all, can you explain what the book Hijacking Bitcoin says? Roger Ver with Steve Patterson. Is this like a rap where, you come in and you say some verses and then like, what does that mean? Which, or are you a featuring? Yeah.
Yeah. There's a music video dropping soon. No. So Roger was very influential in terms of me developing my own understanding of what Bitcoin is, what it was supposed to be, how it was designed. And so his and my philosophy of Bitcoin overlap massively, like 95% at least. So something that we can talk about in more detail, but there was a big fight in the Bitcoin world several years ago. And what was back in maybe 2016, 2017, what was actually the mainstream view of all Bitcoiners, that we have to scale the technology a particular way, that view wound up losing in dramatic fashion in a big fight, a big civil war that happened at Bitcoin. And yet, though this sort of culminated in 2017, lots of drama happening in 2017, there really wasn't any book that explained the perspective of OG Bitcoiners like Roger Ver and myself and countless others, people like Stephen Pear and Tony Galippi from BitPay, Brian Armstrong from Coinbase. There was a rather common sense perspective that was kind of lost to history. We lost the narrative battle due to censorship and a whole lot of propaganda that was happening online at the time. And then despite this being very important, especially for libertarians, nobody wrote about it. It was just kind of a dirty, ugly fight that left a bitter taste in everybody's mouth. And then the Bitcoin narrative was replaced by this current narrative, which is the idea that Bitcoin is supposed to be a store of value that you don't actually use as a medium of exchange. And you're not supposed to actually access the blockchain. You're supposed to go through a company or a bank to access the blockchain. This new narrative sort of replaced the old one. And yet we never, the old idea, the old vision was never given its due. So I teamed up with Roger to write what happened to Bitcoin. It's in 3 parts. The first part of the book is explaining how Bitcoin was originally designed, the original vision of Bitcoin. The second part of the book is kind of a bunch of historical facts about what took place from the period of maybe 2013 to 2017, and how Roger and I would say the project was taken over and corrupted, and the vision was sort of inverted to a very different system. And then the third part is explaining alternative technology called Bitcoin Cash, which is sort of trying to keep the original vision alive. But that's not the main part of the book. It's not the smallest part is talking about Bitcoin Cash. Most of it is just very important information explaining how Bitcoin was designed and then what happened from the time of 2013 to 2017.
Okay, great. So the what I guess though, but just with the what that just means, like, you helped him to get it down into words and to organize his thoughts. Is that the way to think about it?
Yeah, well, I did the writing part. I mean, he's a super busy guy. So I did the writing of the book, but it accords, I didn't have to ask him too much about a lot of his philosophical perspective about Bitcoin because I had already, I'm a Verian myself.
Okay. So, and I will have said this already, Stephen, this has come in the like the pre-recorded introduction to this, but I think the best thing I can do is sort of let you present and push back on certain things, because I know this is a very contentious issue. And I will say, folks, even if you can't stand Roger Ver and what he stands for in the Bitcoin world, and maybe you hate Steve too or whatever, it's a very compelling book. Like, it's interesting to see it from their perspective. Like, at the very, like, even if you were, I don't know, the head of NATO, you would want to know, like, what is Putin saying in his speeches? Or I'm kind of doing a goofy analogy, but like, you got to understand it to see from the other person's perspective, because it's not insane. Like, for example, let me ask you this. We'll just right out of the gate, Steve. So in terms of, is Bitcoin originally, did Satoshi think Bitcoin was supposed to be analogous to big gold bars stored in vaults that people traded paper claims on versus little gold coins that people use to buy cups of coffee and whatever? It seems pretty clear from the original white paper and then the post he made that Satoshi, at least at the beginning, thought, no, this is supposed to be day-to-day spendable money for the average person to use to get away from the other alternatives that, the states and commercial banks have given us. Is that, right?
Yeah.
So that's a good starting point.
It is unambiguous that Satoshi Nakamoto designed a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. If you read the white paper, which is the original document that explained what Bitcoin was to the world, he mentions payments, everyday commerce, transactions throughout the white paper. It's very clearly the point of the technology. He doesn't talk about a store of value. That concept doesn't come up in the white paper. And throughout all of his forum posts and emails, it couldn't be clearer that he was envisioning a digital cash system where he gives analogies that it should be as easy as putting coins into a vending machine to get a candy bar. So he says it's probably not right now good for micropayments. That is, like payments at the time, he probably meant like less than $1. Although right now you could probably go down farther than that. I mean, the original Bitcoin technology, you could make, 25-cent payments make sense, 15-cent payments make sense because the transaction fees were supposed to be zero or like a penny. But yeah, you're paying for a cup of coffee or paying for a pack of gum was absolutely something that he envisioned. The idea is that it's a digital cash system that you don't have to go to a bank. You don't have to have approval from a trusted third party in order to make the exchange go through, which is why it was so exciting.
And that's what the phrase peer-to-peer is doing in that original description, right?
Exactly. And what it has turned into, because it has failed to scale for various reasons that weren't inherent to the technology, but because a small faction of Bitcoiners wound up taking over and eventually becoming the dominant faction, it's turned into a system where people are actively discouraged from using it in commerce. They say, you're not supposed to use your Bitcoin. You're supposed to sit on it and hold it, and it'll just appreciate in value. And then maybe institutional money will get involved. And someday in the future, we'll have second layers that you can use to transact your Bitcoin in everyday commerce. But the second layers either don't work, or all of them are effectively custodial, which means it's like you have a company account at PayPal, and if you send somebody Bitcoin through PayPal, it's just sending a number from one account to another at PayPal. They can censor the transaction. Bitcoin doesn't actually move on the blockchain. So it's the whole point has kind of been undermined by this push to get people just to buy the Bitcoin and hold it and make sure you don't use it in commerce.
Yeah. So, and that is something that, again, the HODL thing has swept the community. And in case there's 2% of the listeners who don't know, so that's HODL. And that was it a Reddit board or something, Steve, where someone meant to say hold and they mistyped it. So the HODL is like a motto now among Bitcoin people. You prove how committed you are and what a purist Bitcoin maxi you are. If it's no, I absolutely just all I do is take all my spare income and buy more Bitcoin, and then I just sit on it, and I don't care if my house is burning down and whatever, my kid needs a transplant. It doesn't matter. I do not, under any circumstances, ever transmit control of my Satoshis to somebody else. And so then it does raise a paradox. Well, how can this ever turn into a money if nobody ever wants to sell it? And I've written on this stuff as an economist to say, well, if what you think is in the long run, eventually that speculative price appreciation will level off once everyone on planet Earth has exposure to Bitcoin in their portfolio, then maybe, okay. But still, just like an intuitive man on the street level, it is kind of weird to say, hey, this is the money of the future, and once I give it to you, don't you ever give it to somebody else. That's not how money works.
Yeah. Well, it's even changed because it's not the money of the future. So there's a massive difference between the marketing and the narrative around Bitcoin today and the actual fundamental technology and the sense making of what the technology can actually do. So if you say it's money of the future, that implies it's still going to be used as a medium of exchange in the future. But how do we bridge the gap from buy it now and don't use it to, okay, now you can start using it in commerce? And the argument was for years that we don't need to worry about scaling the underlying technology, because in the future, this new technology called the Lightning Network, which is a second layer, that's going to be the panacea where we can now use it in everyday commerce. and you don't actually have to touch the blockchain. We have this complex, cool new technology where you get the benefits of the hard money parts of Bitcoin, and then you get also the benefits of these instant transactions with the Lightning Network. So this argument was used to delay scaling for multiple years. There were promises made to high heaven that the Lightning Network was going to be the thing that makes Bitcoin cash. Well, the Lightning Network arrived a few years ago, and it doesn't work very well for technical reasons that are explained in the book and were understood like back in 2015. There are profound problems with the Lightning Network, not least of which is that you have to access the blockchain just to use the Lightning Network, which means if transaction fees are $50 on the main network, you have to pay $50 just to open up a Lightning channel on the main chain, which doesn't make any sense. Now, there's all kinds of deep technical problems with Lightning, which now people are starting to acknowledge, okay, all these promises didn't pan out. Oopsie, we don't really have a plausible mechanism for turning Bitcoin into cash. But we just kind of hold up our hands and say, well, maybe hopefully somebody will figure this new tech out in the future. Maybe we'll have a new technological breakthrough that makes Bitcoin usable in cash. But I don't see signs of that happening anywhere. In fact, I see lots of signs of the opposite. That in fact, as we explain in the book, Bitcoin not being used as cash, Bitcoin being used as a speculative asset is quite beneficial to the existing political and financial system. So Bitcoin in its current structure is not a threat to the financial establishment because, for many reasons, the on-roads and off-roads of Bitcoin are totally captured by KYC. So in other words, in order to buy Bitcoin
know your customer.
or sell Bitcoin, know your customer, yes. So in order to buy or sell Bitcoin just on your average exchange, you have to submit, photo ID to Coinbase, for example, to say that you are who you say you are. You're not going to be participating in money laundering, and they can track your Bitcoin on the blockchain, and it's tied to your ID because of know your customer laws. So the idea, like if the on-roads to Bitcoin are all captured with KYC and you don't even use it really in commerce and all the big transactions are monitored by the government and are used all the time in police raids and busts, they just do blockchain analytics because all the transactions are public. The big transactions they know who's making what transaction because the blockchain is a public ledger. I don't really see an avenue for this technology to make the world a freer, better place. It looks like it's just a speculative investment. And then the only other attempt I've heard from libertarian types, like maybe Saifedean Ammous talks about this in the Bitcoin Standard, is the idea that, oh, well, we're going to put the world on a Bitcoin standard, which means that just like the gold standard, you're going to have banks that were holding on to the gold, and then they would give you some sort of a token that you could trade that's as good as gold. We're going to do that with Bitcoin as well. So the banks will hold all the Bitcoin, and they're going to give you an IOU, a pinky promise that says, and that asset that you're trading there, that IOU for Bitcoin is just as good as Bitcoin. And if we do that, then like that's going to put us, that'll be a hard money standard or something. I mean, there's only a slight problem here, which is you just reinvented the same problem that the gold standard has, which is what happens when the institutions don't make good on the IOUs. There's nothing, if the individuals aren't actually owning and trading the actual coin themselves, or they're not accessing the blockchain themselves, they're just using some corporate IOU promise, you haven't really invented anything new here.
Yep. Okay, before and I do want to pursue that because that's one of the probably critical issues here that you and I should probably spend some more time on. But before, I think there might be this more fundamental confusion among especially people who are not hip deep into Bitcoin. And couldn't somebody say, guys, what the heck is going on here? I thought the whole point of this, the whole peer-to-peer thing, was that no one's in charge of Bitcoin, and I don't need to worry about a corrupt management stealing my stuff or whatever, or just so. How can it be that some people are saying, oh no, Roger Ver and his cabal are evil, and they're saying no, it's these other guys that are corrupt, and they're all. I thought no one was supposed to be in charge of Bitcoin, so how is this even possible?
It's an excellent question, Bob, and I was confused about this 10 years ago. So Somewhere in the archives, there's an interview of you, me, and my brother. I don't know if you remember this. It was like a Bitcoin Brothers interview. I think Liberty.me put it on. And we were talking, I think it was 2015 or 2014 or something. And we were talking
I'm
about
like
Bitcoin
ChatGPT.
at that
I
time.
only have like a 7-year rolling window. So no, I don't remember this at all.
Outside the training window. So yeah, we were talking about this type of stuff. And I had just written a smaller book called, in fact, I have a copy here, What's the Big Deal About Bitcoin, which is no longer for sale because it doesn't describe the actual Bitcoin. So if you want to learn what Bitcoin is, this is the updated version. But anyway, this came out in the end of 2014. And the idea was, as you're talking about, well, Bitcoin is not controlled. There's no central power that is issuing the Bitcoins. There's no central power that's regulating the transactions. What I overlooked at the time, and a lot of us overlooked, is that there is in fact a central power or a few central powers, and that comes from the software development of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is not like Saifedean Ammous talks about in the Bitcoin Standard as if Bitcoin is like a feature of nature. There's like Neptune and Pluto and Bitcoin, and they're all out there and they can't be changed. They're like inaccessible from humans. That's not what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is a software project. And as a software project, there are humans involved at every level of it. So what happened, just historically speaking, this shouldn't even be controversial, is that there was a small number, really a handful of software developers that exercised enormous power over the Bitcoin protocol at the software level. The way they did this historically is they found that like there was a scaling limitation. There was a scaling limitation in Bitcoin called the block size limit. And the block size limit is, you can think of it as just a throughput limit for the network. And it was supposed to be temporarily capped at 7 transactions per second. That was supposed to be removed, and we were gonna either eliminate or raise the block size limit substantially to allow for global scaling. Okay, so what happened was a small group of developers did not allow that temporary block size limit to be raised. So what they did is they exercised veto power. They said, we're the ones that are updating the code in GitHub. We're the individual group that you have to go through, where it's just a social hierarchy like any other. And if we decide that Bitcoin is not going to scale along the lines of Satoshi's vision, we're going to put our foot down and say, we're not going to change the code. So by not changing the code, what they wound up doing was totally inverting what Bitcoin was supposed to be. By not changing the code, that's why there was a scaling limitation in Bitcoin. That's why there's like this idea that blockchains can't scale. That's not true at all. Blockchains were designed to scale. That's part of the brilliance of the blockchain breakthrough, is that it can scale really, really, really efficiently and effectively. There's just a small group of people, the Bitcoin Core developers, many of which formed their own for-profit company called Blockstream, that said, look, we're the people that decide what goes into the final code of Bitcoin. And we say that Bitcoin is not going to scale this way. We're not going to raise the block size limit. So you can make your own coin if you would like to go a different direction. So there's that's not even that story. I don't even think people who would disagree with my perspective could disagree with the facts of that part of the story.
Let me try it this way, Steve. So this is good.
Yeah.
Could someone on the other side say, no, what we're doing is the original Bitcoin, and that's why we still call it Bitcoin, and what you guys did forked away from us. We're the true heritage going back to, King David and Abraham and Moses, whatever. I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek. That we're the original thing. You guys changed the code, and all we're doing is consistent. And so now are we just quibbling about what did Satoshi have in mind? And did he originally do the 7 transactions per second and then just say, well, yeah, I'm just doing this to get it off the ground? But obviously, and then do they disagree? Because I actually don't know that. Is there a disagreement over what Satoshi envisioned the transaction limit being, or does everybody concede he thought it?
Everybody will concede that Satoshi designed Bitcoin to scale with bigger blocks. That's even the most. I mean, unless somebody is just going to straightforward lie to your face, there are people who are quoted in the book who will say, even the people that participated in the censorship and the propaganda that was happening on the forums online discussing Bitcoin, they'll even concede, yes, the the vision of Satoshi Nakamoto was in line with people like Gavin Andreessen and Mike Hearn, who are big blockers, who said, of course, the tech should grow according
and so
to
I hope I have this right, is because I've talked to people in both camps. I don't know this as well as, like, I know, Austrian fractional reserve banking arguments, for example, but on this is the argument from and so in the book, Roger and you, because it was with Steve Patterson, to keep the camps distinct, it's like the Bitcoin Cash versus Bitcoin Core. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
Just to avoid, I guess, partly to avoid
I
calling them Bitcoin, because that makes it sound like one's the true one.
Yes, that's how we do it in the book. I think for this discussion, it's helpful to talk about it, at least right now, as big blockers.
Fair, good.
And
Yeah,
small
that's more
blockers.
fun and intrinsic to the dispute as opposed to labels. Okay, so these small blockers, are they? Am I correct in saying they're going to say, well, part of the advantage of the small block is this maintains fidelity to Satoshi's original vision, where anybody can just download the whole history going back to the original transactions? Well, hang on.
No.
I'm not saying do you agree with that, but do you agree that that's what they might say?
No, I know. I'm saying they wouldn't say that. Yeah. So these, to explain this, the Steelman, the small block perspective, the idea is by keeping blocks small, it will keep costs of validating the blocks down. So when you have, if you're running a node, a Bitcoin full node, it downloads the blocks and then it validates all the transactions. So the small blockers argument is, okay, we're going to keep the blocks really small so that when the node is downloading the block and validating the transaction, the costs are low, which will allow it to be more decentralized. Okay, that is the small block perspective. That is not Satoshi's perspective explicitly, because he wrote in multiple places, as it's quoted in the book, your average user is not supposed to run his own full node. So Bitcoin was designed so that you can verify your own transactions with what's called SPV, or simplified payment verification, something like that. And that allows you to use a teeny tiny little bit of data, regardless of how large the block size is. You're using, I don't know, it's like in the kilobyte range, an itty bitty little bit of data to verify your own transactions. What you can't do is verify everybody else's transaction, because you don't have to download the entire block. So the small block, this is a complete difference in philosophy. The small block perspective is that everybody should be downloading a full node. They should be running full node software, which means they should be downloading the entire blockchain and validating every single block on the ledger in order to maintain security. But that is unambiguously not how Satoshi designed the system. And there are one more thing. There are quotes in there where he literally says this almost verbatim. He says something like, right now, the way the system works, this was in like 2010 or something, is where everybody on the network is doing the fully validation thing. Everybody's doing what we would call mining, but the intended, that's not the intent at scale. At scale, the user, I believe this is an exact quote, the system is designed to allow users just to be users, meaning they're going to be using simplified payment verification. And so it doesn't matter what the size of blocks are.
So maybe, anyway, that is what I was trying to get at when I heard somebody explaining why they thought the small block was a good, but you're right. So maybe to say, and that's exactly coming from Satoshi's lips, maybe they wouldn't say that, because if they know but the point being,
100%.
If originally,
the history, they wouldn't say it.
If Bitcoin was supposed to be this decentralized thing where that the small blocker could say, regardless of whether Satoshi would have endorsed this or not, the small blocker would say, no, if we allow for bigger and bigger blocks, eventually it's going to get to the point where only like humongous companies with warehouses full of servers are going to be able to validate the transactions, and then you have the concentration of power, and then it's like, oh, those 5 companies are in charge of Bitcoin, and we don't want that. So to keep it decentralized, that anybody can download it and run it and participate in mining, that's why you got to keep the transactions, or the block size small. That's the claim.
Right. So let me say a couple of things on that. Sort of. So they wouldn't say that anybody should be able, or anybody realistically would be participating in mining, because for many, many, many years now, only big companies can really do that anyway. It's an unbelievable amount of electricity and hash power is being put into maintaining the Bitcoin network. What they would say is anybody needs to be able to download and verify the world's transactions. They need to be able to verify the full blocks themselves on their phone or something like that. Now, the theoretical concern is that that would lead to centralization. However, it is also almost almost verbatim quote that Satoshi says, as it is in Hijacking Bitcoin, that I wish I could get the exact quote, but he says that it will consolidate into big server farms. That the people who are processing the transactions, just like you have in any market, you have specialization of labor. The people who are doing the heavy lifting for network maintenance, the miners, are going to consolidate into, quote, big server farms. I know that's an exact quote, big server farms. So that's not like a speculative concern, or is it like in the idea, when you see the Bitcoin through Satoshi's vision of how he designed it, that is a predicted future state. And that's okay because the network doesn't require average users to verify the world's transactions. That's like a weird, that's a new idea that Satoshi would have thought is very foolish and would never allow Bitcoin to scale.
Okay. All right. Well, you're kind of answering the question, because I remember when I heard, back when because what happened originally, Bitcoin, it was cool, it worked, it started gaining traction, and the transaction fees were either zero or very. It was like, I remember in the early days, not that I did it, but like I could watch people doing it. I knew a guy where it was like you didn't have to. You didn't have to attach a fee involved. Like that was just kind of like to bump your thing up in a queue, but it would get processed even if you didn't pay a fee yourself. Like the mining reward was enough to get it included in a block eventually. And then there was a point at which it was like the fees were crazy and people were complaining, like early adopters, like, I don't want to buy something right now because it's like, 50% of the transaction would be the fee. This is crazy.
Yeah, I got to say a few things on this. So in the book, there's a quote from Steam, the gaming platform. I don't know if you've heard of Steam. It's where millions of people download computer games and play them, and other games. And they were accepting Bitcoin back in the day, and they had to eventually stop accepting Bitcoin because what happened was you would have these fee spikes where people could pay $50 for a transaction. And if they, for example, one of the many problems that could happen is if they tried to get the transaction refunded, how the heck is that supposed to work? So let's say you're trying to buy a $30 game and there's a $30 transaction fee. So I, the user, spend $60 to put the transaction out there, and then I decide I want a refund. And so in order to do the refund, that would be another $30 transaction fee. So it was a complete nightmare from the perspective of merchants. A bunch of merchants just decided to stop accepting Bitcoin. This was like in 2017. That one of the many fee spikes that happened. And furthermore, it should be noted, this is critical for people if they haven't really dug deep into Bitcoin. The fact that fees spiked and were $50 plus on multiple occasions is actually part of the intended future design of Bitcoin. I want to be very clear and fully explain it so people understand I'm not exaggerating here. The Bitcoin core developers, many of them, are on record saying that the system they envision, in which there are high fees and relatively slow transactions on Bitcoin. Sounds crazy. It is crazy, but the reason for it is this. By preventing Bitcoin from scaling on-chain by increasing the size of the blocks, there's a critical problem that is going to be facing the miners on Bitcoin, and that's this. How do you pay for mining security? How do you pay for hash rate to keep the network secure? Well, historically, there has been a block reward. That is, every 10 minutes, there's a small amount of Bitcoins that are coming into existence. And that new block reward, it's called, minting new Bitcoins, can pay miners for their time to invest all of this electricity and resources into securing the Bitcoin network. Okay, but that mining reward goes down over time. It used to be 50, it started at 50 Bitcoin per block. Now it's at I think it's 6.25 or maybe even half that. It keeps dropping in half every 4 years. Okay, but if you play that out, if you only have 7 transactions per block and your block reward is diminishing, you're making less and less and less per block. So imagine, just as a thought experiment, imagine that let's say the transaction fee is $1 per transaction. Every block can have 2,000 transactions in it. That's $2,000 per block going to miners. Okay. So that would not be very much money. That right now, I don't know what they're making. They're making lots of money because the price is very high. But if you have a small amount of transactions and you have a decreasing block reward, the only way you can maintain reimbursing the miners for their hash rate is by either having an astronomically high price so that the tiny amount of transaction fees that you get are worth a lot, or having incredibly high transaction fees themselves. So there's literally, in the long run, there is literally only one way to have miners continue to get paid at high levels to support the Bitcoin network, and that is with high transaction fees, $50, $100 plus, because the block reward is eventually going to zero. So the developers understand this, and they understand, okay, if we're not going to reimburse miners by having, let's say, 1 million transactions with a small transaction fee, we're going to need a small amount of transactions with high transaction fees. So they are also unambiguous in saying at the layer 1 level on Bitcoin, they anticipate there being very high transaction fees such that your average user is not going to be using the blockchain at the layer 1 level. That's going to be for big banks who can afford $1,000 transaction that will then go to the miners and pay for security. So high layer 1 fees are an essential part of the new Bitcoin vision. And this would have been, I mean, this still is, when I say it aloud, it just blows my mind. But this is an inversion of what Satoshi originally thought. It's hard to imagine getting farther off base compared to the original vision, where you had low layer 1 transaction fees, a huge amount of throughput. Everybody's able to use the blockchain for themselves, and then that's where you get the reimbursement for miners, versus it being like the small select group of central bankers that
so that does make sense. So again, and like Steve's saying, folks, there are quotes in the now. I didn't go and look up the original sources to see was the quote taken out of context or whatever, but yes, the quotes prima facie do support that Steve is not inventing a straw man here. There are people in the Bitcoin core community who are saying, yes, the future is at the layer 1 level, that there's going to be high transaction fees because it's only going to be big boys moving actual things on the Bitcoin itself blockchain around. So again, going back to our analogy, if it's like there's giant gold bars in all these bank vaults, occasionally one bank will ship gold from one vault to another, but they'll have armored cars and a bunch of, helicopter escorts. And so that's expensive. You wouldn't do that to have armored cars to buy a cup of coffee. No, it would only be to move something of high value. And then again, well, how do you use the gold then to buy the cups of coffee? Oh, because people on their smartphone, they have claims, IOUs issued by those big vaults on the underlying gold bars that don't move around. And then people just swap the IOUs with their phones. And I go to the merchant and I get a cup of coffee. I tap my phone. And now that vault says, oh, this little sliver of the gold bar that originally the one guy owned, now in our record keeping, the coffee merchant owns. Okay, but the gold bar just sits there because it's so expensive to move it around. Okay.
That's exactly correct. And I was just trying to find a quote here. So for example, there's a popular commentator, Tur de Meester, who was a Bitcoin maximalist. And he says, at full maturity, using the Bitcoin blockchain will be as rare and specialized as chartering an oil tanker. So if you think about how, like oil futures are traded, there's a bunch of speculation about the price of oil. And then like very rarely do you actually have people chartering the oil tanker to actually move the oil from point A to point B. And that's the system that they're imagining for Bitcoin.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Is when that famous fork happened, and if you want to, in terms of you answering this, if you want to give history, or feel free to take this for as long or as short as you want, Steve, is Bitcoin Cash what, Roger and you and some of those other guys think this is more consistent with Satoshi's vision? And if that's true, is it like, hey, the free market's awesome, people who like the one vision can buy BTC, and the people who like your guys' vision can buy BCH, and what's the problem? It's let a million flowers bloom here.
Yeah. So before I answer that question, I do want to say one more thing that hopefully will wake people up, perhaps.
This show is very
There is an
exciting. They're
assumption.
already riveted. What are you talking about?
True. Um, okay. So you and I would have thought back in 2014, I would imagine, that we would have bought this idea. I know it's in What's the Big Deal About Bitcoin? The idea that there's a hard limit to the numbers of Bitcoins that are out there. This is one of those sacrosanct axiomatic assumptions about Bitcoin, that at the end of the day, at least they
Yep,
can't
it's going to
inflate
top out at 21 million,
the
and
supply.
that's as true as that
Right.
pi is an irrational number.
Right. Oh boy, this is getting exciting. So it turns out not even the 21 million cap is as hard as we previously thought. In fact, one of the Bitcoin core developers, who's brought up multiple times in this book for having interesting connections with potentially individuals and intelligence agencies, has floated the idea on multiple occasions that perhaps there is one secret way to get out of the problem that I just articulated with the small amount of transactions plus high transaction fees. There is actually one way to get around that problem, and that is to increase the amount of
Right.
coins that the network produces. Instead of having a hard cap of 21 million, we say, well, we're just going to have a decreasing amount. Maybe it'll be, 0.001 that's created every block ad infinitum. That way, perhaps if you have a high enough price of Bitcoin, that could pay for network security indefinitely in the future. And this is something that is completely technically possible. And though it seems sacrosanct, the only reason it will or will not happen is because of decisions that a handful of people make. So factually speaking, you may think that it's a mathematical impossibility that the amount of Bitcoin will never increase. That's not true. It's actually on the table. I'm not sure if it will. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm like 50-50 in what's going to happen with Bitcoin in the future. And if it does happen, I guarantee there will be a massive propaganda and censorship campaign, just like we saw happen in 2015 and 2016. So this is not some feature of physics out there. That hard 21 million limit is in fact dependent on whether or not people decide to keep it or not. Okay, I just wanted to say that just because that's a challenging one of those assumptions that I would have been shocked to hear.
Well, I will
10
say
years
on
ago.
that, Steve. So Silas Barta and I, in our book, Understanding Bitcoin, I think is what we called it. Yeah. We did get into there. Like, we did say how strict, like, so people could understand what do we mean when we say it's, outside human control. But wait a minute, but if there's a bug, they can fix it. So that seems kind of, and we did get into that. And I think we picked the 21 million and to say, in principle, yes, but we just argued, we thought that would be just like, we speak differently from how Shakespeare spoke, but would ain't ever be proper grammar? Well, probably not, but technically it could. It's just the community surely wouldn't reckon. We kind of made that argument that
Right.
the Bitcoin fans are so wed to the 21 million cap, presumably they would be outraged. But strictly speaking, if that's what the miners all started doing, then that would happen.
The miners
And the developers,
and the developers and whoever has infiltrated Bitcoin. If it would, in our opinion, it appears that there are companies that may have ties to government that have infiltrated Bitcoin, and if they decide, if the Michael Saylors of the world and the BlackRocks of the world, who are now the people who are really calling the shots in Bitcoin, if they decide that, well, in their expert judgment, having a small indefinite inflation in Bitcoin would be good, and it would be necessary to protect the network from yada yada yada, that's probably what's going to happen. As we discovered, living through what the civil war in Bitcoin, there are powers out there that are way, way, way greater than like the community of Bitcoiners online. Okay, I think libertarians who, like myself, who were Bitcoiners early on, were incredibly naive in understanding the power of politics, the power of infiltration, the power of propaganda, the power of censorship. We didn't understand these things. So if it can already happen to where you're having a 1 megabyte block size limit or 7 transactions per second limit on Bitcoin, that's completely insane. Nobody would have thought that was a good idea in 2011. If that's already become the norm, and people are like, yeah, Bitcoin has to have a 7 transaction per second limit on it, I see it's not a stretch in my mind at all to think, oh yeah, of course they're going to decide, well, the original vision didn't work, and just like we had to change it a little bit once, we have to change it a little bit again. Okay, so I do want to
Yep.
get to your question
Okay.
about Bitcoin Cash. It's a really good one. And the short answer is Bitcoin Cash is undoubtedly the alternative cryptocurrency, which is most in the spirit right now of Satoshi's original vision. There's another one, Bitcoin SV, that also claims to be in the same spirit. They had a lot of controversy because one of the people there claimed to be Satoshi Nakamoto and appears to be fraudulent. So we're going to put that one aside. But outside of that unique case, Bitcoin Cash is the one which has a group of developers. It has a community. It has a network. It has a bunch of companies that accept it and are working on it, which is trying to scale on chain. And when you actually run the numbers, like chapter 7 in the book talks about some of the numbers involved and how utterly insane it is that BTC, Bitcoin, was capped at 7 transactions per second. This was crazy like in 2012, but the idea in 2024 that like you have this a couple megabytes every 10 minutes are produced on the Bitcoin network, it's multiple orders of magnitude off from what is technologically possible right now without really causing any decentralization problems. It just doesn't make any sense. So anyway, Bitcoin Cash is trying to scale on chain layer 1 like Satoshi originally designed. Now, Bitcoin Cash also is a human project and a community project, and it's got social problems. It's got hierarchical problems. It had forked 2 more times since 2017 that fractured the community smaller and smaller. So it's no panacea, but I know Roger and myself, we're both multi-coin people. Like if it's not going to be Bitcoin Cash, that's fine. It could be anything that works in everyday commerce. Like the niche for peer-to-peer digital cash is still somehow not filled 14 years after or 15 years after Bitcoin was released. There's still somehow this bigger market of peer-to-peer electronic cash with low transaction fees. Like nobody's really doing that right now very well. And I will say it's also not just a matter of preference of one Bitcoin or another Bitcoin. There are substantial existential risks of the captured, I would say the mainstream version of Bitcoin, which from our perspective appears to be captured. So like I said, it's a public ledger with a small amount of transactions on it. So it doesn't cost the government much time or money to do very deep chain analysis to figure out who's transacting with whom, to know their identities. And like blockchain analysis is used all the time in busting criminals who are trying to use Bitcoin. If anybody's still trying to use like Bitcoin on, the dark web or something, that's very dumb because those transactions are just going to be analyzed from the government and you're going to end up getting arrested. Like, don't do that. That's a very bad idea. And also the idea of like, trading IOUs of Bitcoin and trading second layers where you're just like, you have to go through a company. This is just reinventing the banking system. This isn't an improvement. This doesn't make the world a freer place. This is just some weird gimmick where we tell this amazing story about how this Bitcoin technology is going to take us into the promised land and it's going to separate money and state. And it's like, that's not just an incorrect narrative. That's kind of dangerous. If you're told that this is some awesome libertarian technology, and it turns out to just be a tool that the state can use to track you and surveil you and monitor you, that's not good. Like that's dark. I think there's an amazing version of Bitcoin and there's like a dystopian version of Bitcoin. And it's very much on the table whether or not we keep stepping towards the dystopian version of Bitcoin.
Okay, I think we got time. Let me ask you one more question and you can answer it again as short or as long as you want. Couldn't somebody who's, hearing what you're saying, and couldn't somebody say something like this to you that, yes, Steve, I get what you're saying, but that original vision, that was not going to work. And what a bunch of us who are the adults in the room decided was strategically, it could not be that we were going to get widespread adoption by the masses if Bitcoin was like this black market thing that was technically illegal or something, and it was the purview of drug dealers. Like that just wasn't going to work. And so instead, what we opted for is, yes, we made it compliant and we work with the big investment banks and whatever. We got ETFs and that's good. So it takes the stigma away from it. So now the public can embrace it. And you're right. You're not going to be able to like stay off grid with it, but at least now we have a very hard money that in some respects is even better than gold. And isn't that an amazing achievement? And that now we can get it.
No, it's not a money.
But that's
if you can't use it in commerce, it's not a money. So what I'll say that that is positive is it's awesome that it made a bunch of libertarians fantastically wealthy. Okay, like cool. We did a really cool thing. In fact, I remember in that interview like 10 years ago, the Bitcoin Brothers interview, there was a part at the end which I remember because everybody laughed and I got like a good laughter. I was like, oh yeah, okay, I said a funny thing. We were talking about the future of Bitcoin, and I said it's gonna end up being that like a bunch of libertarians are impoverished because it goes to zero and it doesn't work, or I said, or their price will be $10,000, and everybody's like, oh, wow, $10,000, can you imagine? And here we are, we're flirting with $100,000 right now for Bitcoin. So hooray, hooray! A lot of libertarians made a lot of money, and I think a lot of good can come from that. But let's not tell lies and pretend like, oh wow, we created this amazing alternate system. And it's hard money. No, it's not. It's not money. If it's a speculative asset and you can't use it as a medium of exchange, and it doesn't really have, when you say it's got these better properties than gold, okay, fair, but not compared to other cryptocurrencies. When we have 10,000 cryptocurrencies to choose from, why? What is it about Bitcoin that is special or unique? Like cryptocurrency itself was an awesome technological breakthrough, and like maybe some other project, maybe Monero or some of these privacy coins will make the world a freer place, and people can use them as money in commerce. That would be cool. But I don't see evidence that that's actually Bitcoin. I see evidence. There's a great quote. I forget who said it, who coined it. It's a phrase that the purpose of a system is what it does. I don't know if you've heard this. I don't. It's excellent way, like systems analytical thinking about how the world works. The purpose of a system is what it does. And if I'm being honest, and about Bitcoin over the last decade or 14 years, what is the purpose of Bitcoin? Chatter aside, theory aside, I think the purpose of Bitcoin is to appreciate in price. And maybe that's good, especially good for early adopters. But if that's all that's going on, I think that's maybe not this amazing invention.
You're turning into Peter Schiff. I'm just gonna.
No. Look, I need to get Peter Schiff a copy of Hijacking Bitcoin, because I think he would find it very interesting.
Yep.
He did shift his argument though, because he used to make different criticisms of Bitcoin, and now he sounds like his criticism of Bitcoin is that you can't use it as a medium of exchange. And it's like, well, that's different than your argument was in 2013 when you were saying that it's not backed by anything or whatever. But yeah, I think Peter would probably like I'm sure he would love the contents of the book, because it just destroys a bunch of the myths that are so commonly repeated in Bitcoin. And there's like very few people who are, challenging the narrative anymore. People are so invested. They have so much to gain from repeating this narrative of buy it and hold it, and the price goes up, you're going to make money, that there's not a strong incentive to be like, maybe this narrative is not grounded in reality anymore.
Okay, fair enough. So I know we've got a hard stop cut up here, Steve. Is there anything else that you want to get in as a final remark before we point people to go buy the book and read for themselves?
No, I would say, so this is a non-hyperbolic claim. I think it's fair to say that if you don't know the information in this book, you can't really have an understanding of Bitcoin. Now, I'm not saying you have to buy the book to understand Bitcoin. Get a free copy. It's out there. If you know where to look. We're not going to come after you.
Did someone hijacking Bitcoin? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they could. Yeah, hijacking Bitcoin squared. If you don't know if you don't know about Satoshi's original division, if you don't understand how the technology has been redesigned, if you don't know what happened with the block size wars and the extreme censorship that took place, if you don't know that, for example, the two most popular discussion platforms for years for talking about Bitcoin online were owned by the same mysterious person who is on record in the book saying, I know how censorship affects people. I'm going to do it anyway for Bitcoin's for the good of Bitcoin. If you don't know that story, I really don't think you can understand what Bitcoin is. You can get wrapped up in narratives, but you can find there are 280 some on citations in the book. There's more citations in the book than there are pages in the book. And you can find all this information out there. It's extremely carefully written and extremely carefully documented. But I think it's fair to say if you don't at least know the information, you can't know Bitcoin.
Okay, fair enough. So thank you, Steve, for helping Roger with the book and coming here and presenting your controversial case. As always, you like controversy and are at the heart of it. And so thanks for your time here today, Steve.
Thanks, Bob.
And thanks everybody for tuning in, and thank you for supporting this platform where we like to foster debate and let you get both sides, and you can make the decision. See you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.